We have talked about big tech, and I do think it's probably the most, if not one of the most important conversations when it comes to free speech right now. But like, you'll have
Hmm.
cases where, say, somebody doesn't get censored on the platform, but then their employer gets notified by people who are upset by what this person posted, and then they lose their job. So, moving the
Yep.
conversation to that, what right do
Yep.
you have to post your thoughts on Facebook or Twitter and then keep your job if your employer doesn't like what you said?
There are two fundamental things to understand to begin with. That fundamental human rights are not given to you by the government. that you don't. The Constitution, the First Amendment of the Constitution, does not give you free speech rights. That the whole concept behind it is that you possess the right to speak your mind and to practice a religion or publish what you want. It's not a right given to you by the state or by the Constitution. It exists as a fundamental human right. And it's an important thing to keep in mind because a lot of people refer to these as First Amendment rights. But it's not a First Amendment right. It just happens to be in the First Amendment of the creation of the federal government. There was a specific provision put in there saying this new government that we're building, the federal government here in North America, doesn't have the right to interfere with your right to free speech. Okay, and so what it really was an explicit uh, prohibition against or the refusal to give to the new government the power to interfere in people's right to free speech. Okay, so if the First Amendment just applies to the government, it doesn't apply to anybody else. That's the second thing to keep in mind. The constitutional amendments that are put in there do not apply to anybody other than the federal government that was being created by that Constitution. When the 14th Amendment was passed, then we began to get a difference. That we began to get new rules that were applicable to the state governments under the 13th and 14th Amendment. The conservatives, the reactionaries, actually argue that all that dealt with was race, right? And that the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment were passed immediately after the Civil War, and that the Civil War was fought solely for the purpose of freeing the black race from slavery. And therefore, these rights that are imposed upon the states to respect only apply to black people. Now, that's the extreme right wing end of the spectrum. On the left end of the spectrum, people argue that these fundamental rights that an individual person possesses ought to be enforceable against everyone. That your next door neighbor can't do anything to you because you happen to hold a political belief that he or she doesn't like, or that you in fact have written a book that they don't like. They can't do things to you to punish you because of that. Now, but the reality is that the balance is somewhere toward the middle of this thing.
There's all kinds of tension, I guess you would just call it. Like, there's a lot of tension on social media. People are expressing views that may or may not be very popular, and then you'll see, hey, this person loses their job.
You have to file a complaint with the Secretary of State where that entity, that private company that tries to fire you, if they're a corporation, you could argue that they ought to have their corporate charter revoked for doing that because they're engaged in a form of conduct which is inappropriate. That you don't argue that it's unconstitutional because they're not but you argue that them functioning as an agent of the state, a state incorporated corporation, if they engage in punishing you or doing something like that, you should demand that their charter be taken away. That's the remedy that you should
That's
go after.
interesting. I had never even thought about that.
No, nobody does. But that's the way to get at them.
So, if you work for the government, though, then I guess you probably could argue some kind of constitutionality. Or no, is it only if you work for the federal government? If you work for a state government or a county government, the rules are different?
No, no. If the county or the state or the city or the federal government fires you, that's a direct violation of your First Amendment rights. or 14th Amendment rights, because they are bound by those constitutional provisions. They can't do that.
All right. So
And that's why the problem that's arising is, well, okay, they don't do anything, but your private employer does.
right.
And that's what you need to look
Okay.
at.
So you
And if they're a corporation, you should go after their charter. And if they're not, then you're in real trouble. If it's just a private business where there's a partnership of family owned, but 99% of all the businesses incorporate because they want to be immunized against personal liability. And so you need to go after their charter and get it
well,
revoked.
I think it's an interesting conversation because on one hand, you know, I can see how if I run a business and I serve a certain constituency and then my employee says something that aggravates whether it's left, right, center, Martian,
Yep.
who cares?
Yep.
That if you're in that situation, should sort of the free market, I guess, in the United States, the free market of ideas, be able to cancel you? I mean, isn't that what free speech is about? I mean, I can see both sides of it. You should be able to say what you want, but also your freedom as a business owner, you should be able to get rid of somebody, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I can see how, like, should you not have the free idea as an employer, the free, and this is just a thought experiment for me because I totally do not know, but I'm just in my head, I'm wondering, does the sort of freedom or the right of the employee supersede the employer's right to say, hey, you made us look bad and my speech has now been interfered with, my ability to do my job has been interfered with because you've made us look bad with your freedom to express your ideas?
Yeah. Only if you're a corporation. If you're a corporation, then there is an avenue available to the person who gets fired to punish that company for doing that, because they go to the Secretary of State and they say, look, at this corporation, which you have empowered through the power of the state, is fired me for simply saying something they didn't like. Okay, when you become a corporation, you have, on the one hand, you have a lot more privileges, but on the other hand, I'm arguing, you have certain obligations because you're a functionary of the state. And therefore, if a corporation fires you, they don't have the same freedom. But if it's a private group, if it's say it's a private shoe store, a person, has 3 or 4 employees and they run a shoe store and they own the shoe store. They haven't attempted to shelter themselves by being a corporation, and you work in their shoe store, and you go out and you deliver a speech saying, I think Donald Trump is a basic troglodyte, and that people all ought to vote against him. And it turns out that the person who owns the shoe shop is a big fan of Donald Trump, and so they fire you. Okay, there's nothing you can do about that
because they're not a corporation.
They're not a corporation. Okay. They're not vested with any powers from the state to do anything.
Okay.
And so therefore, you may be upset about it, but it's just like as if your mother-in-law stops talking to you because she thinks you're a Democrat.
Right. Well, so like in my case, when I was in TV news, I was required to sign a contract that said I represent my company on and off the job. And if I do something that makes them look bad, they have the right to fire me. I'm guessing if you put pen to paper on that and you sign away your rights, then you're screwed. Would that be fair?
That's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. You can argue. You could go to the Better Business Bureau and try to stop a company, if they're a corporation. Again, you could try to stop them from extracting that agreement from you, and it's bad business practice. And then you could try to regulate them. But if they're a corporation, they can condition your employment on almost anything they want. But they can't they can't say, however, if you marry a black person, I'm going to fire you, because that racial discrimination has a special power under the 13th Amendment that it says that slavery and all vestiges of slavery shall be abolished, and the Congress of the United States has the authority to pass whatever statutes are necessary to protect people against racial discrimination. When you're talking about the state not being able to violate your right to free speech, that every instrumentality of the state Board of Education, the state schools, the state highway department, the police departments, anything that any institution or group that derives its power from the state is restricted by the 14th Amendment.
Okay, I want to switch us real fast to you're a student at a university. This has happened a few times now over the last few months, and you post something that your fellow students find reprehensible, and they tell the university about it and say, how could you have somebody like this in the classrooms? And then you either get kicked out of school, suspended, you have to apologize, whatever else. What does a student have freedom wise when it comes to social media and their university? The universities would say in some of these cases, hey, we have a code of conduct that you signed on to when you came onto campus. Nobody forced you to come to school here, and you're violating our interpretation of our code of conduct. You're out. The student would maybe say, yeah, but this is my, my free speech, and you can't have a code of conduct that violates my free speech. So that makes your code of conduct irrelevant. How do you work through that one?
First of all, there's a different situation. If it's a state school, if it's a state university, then there's no doubt at all about them being restricted by First Amendment or 14th Amendment in this case. But now, if they're a private institution, then it's the same thing as you being hired by this news media group that says, here, you have to sign this agreement that you're on duty 24 hours and anything you say or do is reflecting on us, and so we can fire you. If they sign that as a condition of their being allowed to be a student there, then that's a contract that they've signed. Now, you may argue that, well, the university is a big, powerful group, and you're just a weak individual student, and they're conditioning my ability to come there as a student on this coerced signing of this document. Well, tough shit. You shouldn't have signed it. You shouldn't have gone there.
When you're talking about free speech, it really shouldn't be about what I think is reprehensible or not, right? It should be about what the law allows. And I think sometimes people garble those two. Like, well, you're so insensitive to have that conversation. Why would you just do that? Well, to me, the argument is not about sensitivity or not. I mean, I wish people were all kinds of nicer things, right? All over the place. To me, like one way or the other, the conversation about whether my free speech or my adversary's free speech is protected is not one of, where does it cross the line on my sensitivities? Or at least it shouldn't be, because that changes culturally over time, right? What today may be perfectly fine for someone to say 100 years from now may be absolutely terrible, or vice versa. And I always think that the reason that I stand up for this issue and I like talking about it is because I truly believe that even if I absolutely hate something that somebody said, if I want the, militia to come after them, then it's only a matter of time before my idea maybe is reprehensible to the powers that be, and then they come after me. So I have to protect my adversary in order to protect myself. That's the way I look at
it. That's the utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning, is how that's what we're doing. It's a kind of a it's just what it is.
It's not ready for law school yet, Allison.
It's a utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning in applying these things. It's sort of indirectly self-serving. You're trying to protect yourself in the long run, rather than be benign about something. But with regard to this, and you get a lot of that. And the fact is that there are judges, in fact, who follow the utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning, and they will extend First Amendment rights only to the point where they think that they need to be granted to protect completely innocent people, or people that they want protected. So that even if you don't agree with something someone's saying, they have a right to say it. They get into all this kind of flowery language, but the reality is they have a limited view of the First Amendment, and that it's just a practical, utilitarian, self-serving thing where they can appeal to people and say, look, you don't want to allow this to happen because it could happen to you. But the bottom line is you need to be able to go the next step of saying, I'm willing to protect someone's right to say something, even if there's no chance that it would ever have any bad reflection on me. Natural law worldview that undergirds the Constitution of the United States. It's another unknown fact about a well-known subject here, but the fact of the matter is that James Madison, who was the principal architect of the Bill of Rights, was a student of a particular guy named John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was a professor at the College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton University. But he taught not only James Madison about moral ethics, but he also taught Aaron Burr And he also, so I've got notes here, catch this, he actually taught 37 of the original federal judges.
Wow.
And he taught 10 cabinet members. He taught 12 members of the Continental Congress. He taught 21 United States senators and 39 United States members of
Why don't more of
Congress.
us know about this guy?
Well, because most people don't know anything about much. Well, they don't know anything. Most people can't pass a test on anything, you know. So there's all kinds of important information that people don't know about. That's why we have these kind of conversations that people can find out about. But this guy, John Witherspoon, taught moral philosophy at the College of New Jersey, and he taught all about this. And he comes from the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment school of natural law. And so that he had this entire concept of these natural law rights that abide to a particular individual human being by dint of their being a human being, which really is more complicated, but it means that we actually have access to an evolving faculty by means of which we can directly discern the unit of phenomenon that bonds every single ultimately irreducible unit of matter in the entire universe into one unified harmonic whole, just so you'll have it in a download. In the warning that you get in your first day of constitutional law, whenever you take a course in law school, is that do not trust the government. Do not trust the government. Don't let the government get in charge of telling you what you can say. And don't let them get into the business of punishing you for what you say. Okay? So your instincts of trying to let everybody say whatever it is they want to say is the right instinct. It's the one that John Witherspoon taught at the College of New Jersey. Your fundamental right to say whatever it is you want, to think whatever it is you want, and to do whatever it is you want, as long as you're not actually physically hurting somebody else. You know, that whole thing, your rights stop where my nose begins.
Again, I'm Allison Morrow. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with people you think might be interested. It really does help when you do that. YouTube says, hey, maybe this is good content, and boosts it with the algorithm and gets more eyes on it, which helps me as a creator. Also, let me know what you thought in the comments section. You can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/AllisonMorrow, and I'll see you next time.